began almost by accident, sparked by a runaway black servant, one of thousands living in fear of the slave owners.
Run away some time since, a Negro lad about 18 years of age answers to the name of Starling, now the property of Ralph Cook at the sign of the Rising Sun in Bassett Street, Bristol. Whoever shall harbour or conceal the said black will be prosecuted as the law directs. But any person who will secure him and give notice to his said master Ralph Cook shall receive 1 guinea reward.
Once caught, runaways could be returned by force to their masters. The capture of one former slave was witnessed by a pioneer abolitionist, Granville Sharp.
Granville Sharp, who had nothing to do with slavery, comes across a black boy in the streets who's badly beaten up and makes a simple inquiry, which is like, what's happened? And gets the story. And when he understands the cruelty endured, the suffering endured by ordinary black people in this country at the hands of cruel masters, he decides, like any decent Englishman or Christian, to do something about it. And he spends the rest of his life campaigning for the end of the slave trade.
Sharp managed to prevent the ship's captain from taking the boy, James Somerset, back on board. According to law, he was just a piece of property, but Sharp took his case to court, arguing that Somerset should be a free man. The case went to the country's top judge, Lord Chief Justice Mansfield, a Scottish landowner. Mansfield agonised for 7 months between equally unpalatable alternatives, challenging an Englishman's property rights or allowing slavery on British soil.
He gave his judgment to the effect that the air of England was too pure to be breathed by a slave. And he ended up, let the black go free, which may not be politically correct, but was a splendid demonstration of his feelings.
One black person was not only free, but family at Mansfield's London home, Ken Wood. His niece's constant companion was Dido Lindsay, the daughter of a captured French slave and Mansfield's nephew, Sir John Lindsay.
She used to appear after dinner, rather to the astonishment of some of the great men of the time who went to Ken Wood, who disapproved of that sort of thing. And not to put too fine a point on it, the Lord Chief Justice got a entirely, I think, false reputation as a kind of nigger lover. And in fact, he was genuinely a very affectionate and kind great uncle to Dido.
Mansfield never revealed whether Dido's presence influenced his judgment. In any event, black people were still for sale in England.
To be sold, a healthy Negro slave named Prince, 17 years of age, measuring 5 feet 10 inches and extremely well grown. Enquire of Joshua Springer in St. Stephen's Lane, who has likewise to sell a 4-wheel chaise.
The Somerset judgment triggered a wave of agitation against the cruelty of the slave trade. At the centre of the campaign led by Sharp were heart-rending testimonies of former slaves. Olaudah Equiano published a best-selling record of his life as a slave. He toured the country on behalf of the Committee to Abolish the Trade. His testimony moved the crowds.
To kidnap our fellow creatures, however they may differ in complexion, is a crime as unjustifiable as cruel. Can any man be a Christian who asserts that one part of the human race were ordained to be in perpetual bondage to another?
Equiano was actually part of a much larger abolitionist movement. There were many white people, of course, but he was part of an abolitionist movement that included a number of black figures. You see letters to the newspapers called Sons of Africa, and they would sign letters or present articles or petition people for change. he was part of a large and important Black community that was becoming literate and very politically active.
Thomas Clarkson became one of abolitionism's moving spirits. As a Cambridge student, Clarkson had written a prize essay condemning slavery. Ending it would become his life's work. Clarkson set off on the first of many fact-finding tours to the great slaving port of Bristol.
The vested interests were incredibly powerful. The merchant ventures who ruled the roost in Bristol up until the 1830s were very much against the abolition of the slave trade, and so were many people in Bristol outside the merchant ventures, the people whose jobs depended on servicing the ships, of building the ships, of manufacturing the goods that were exported to Guinea, of processing the stuff that was imported from the Caribbean. It was said that the grass would grow in the docks of Bristol if the slave trade were abolished. So there was tremendous opposition.
Clarkson inspected dozens of ships and talked to sailors who had seen the treatment of slaves on the seas and in the Caribbean. The merchant venturers retaliated.
It has been found that the African and West Indian trade constitutes 3/5 of the commerce of the port of Bristol, and that if a bill should pass into law, the decline of Bristol must inevitably follow, and the ruin of thousands.
While Clarkson was touring the slave ports, Equiano heard of an atrocity that was to seize the nation's attention. In September 1781, the Liverpool ship Zong was carrying 442 slaves from Africa to the West Indies when the captain, Luke Collingwood, lost his way. Soon water ran short. Slave rations were cut. Collingwood's cargo began to die before his eyes. He decided to throw 133 sick and starving slaves overboard. He assured the crew that they would not lose their share of the profits. The insurers would pay up. In court, the lawyers argued that drowning slaves was no different from ditching horses.
This starts a stream of protest, and more crucially, it starts people thinking, can you really equate black slaves with horses or other kind of cargo? And increasingly people are saying, no, these are our fellow humans. They are not chattels. You cannot treat people as property, as cargo, as goods in this way.
After this outrage, the cause won an unlikely convert. The Church of St Mary Woolnoth in the City of London recruited a repentant former slave ship captain, John Newton, as its minister. Newton's hymn, Amazing Grace, celebrated the finding of truth and freedom.
He talks about his conversion from being a slaver to supporting abolitionism. And he makes these rather stammering but deeply felt sermons on this subject, offering himself as an example of a conversion process which the nation at large must take part in.
I have a conviction that the share I formerly had in the trade binds me in conscience to plead for the end to a commerce so iniquitous, so destructive as the African slave trade.
The abolitionists knew that their case had to reach many people who could barely read. They used methods that would be recognized today. Their slogan was taken up everywhere.
That was what was needed at the time. A simple appeal using one image which was instantly recognizable and, if you like, a soundbite. Am I not a man and a brother? From towns, from villages, from all social classes, people sometimes who could hardly sign their names would sign their names and present petitions against slavery. And this single issue caught the British imagination. White people were marching and petitioning on behalf of black people.
Years before they were allowed to vote, ordinary men, and for the first time women too, were petitioning Parliament. Abolitionist propaganda hammered home the inhumanity of the passage across the Atlantic. Clarkson revealed that each slave was forced into a space smaller than a coffin for the entire 6-week journey. This shocked people who would not have subjected their animals to such treatment. Clarkson's poster of a Liverpool slave ship, the Brooks, carrying 600 slaves, went up across the nation. The campaigners believed that it would only be a matter of time before Parliament took its lead from the people and abolished the slave trade. To lead the political campaign, Clarkson had recruited a respected independent member of Parliament, William Wilberforce.
They both realised they couldn't manage without each other. Wilberforce, the first-class orator, the man who had influence, the man who had money, the man who was accepted by the public as being immensely popular. Wilberforce knew that he couldn't cope without the facts in front of him, and there was a quote about him needing an intellectual walking stick, and that was Thomas Clarkson.
But for all his popularity, Wilberforce wasn't going to have an easy ride. Ranged against him were the most important political figures of the day, from the king downwards.
It's difficult for us to imagine, isn't it, that anybody could oppose this thing at that time. Of course, there were the great trading ports, Liverpool and Bristol, whose prosperity depended entirely on the trade, and they had their members of Parliament. But apart from that, the West Indian sugar planters had their own representatives, agents in this country. I think it's estimated they had more than 50 tied members in the House of Commons who would support their case. But 50 is quite a good thing when you're counting for votes.
The pro-slavery MPs weren't popular, but they didn't need to be. As long as influence could be bought, the slave trade was safe in establishment hands.
The West India interest and the mercantile interests associated with them put up a long and, one would have to say, relatively successful rearguard defense of slavery and the slave trade, which became hugely unpopular because it became a symbol, really, of what was called at the end of the 18th century old corruption, of an unreformed political system where people with money could simply buy influence and power.
Today, a Liverpool street bears the name of one of the city's biggest slave trading families. The Tarletons personified the old corruption. Thomas Tarleton's family firm fitted out dozens of slave ships, and his grandsons became MPs principally to defend the slave trade. The Tarletons could reach places and exercise influence that the abolitionists could only dream of.
This is a letter from John Tarleton, the MP, dated the 5th of February 1788. Dear Clayton, Mr. Pitt on Saturday morning sent for me into Downing Street, where I remained from 11 till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then the letter goes on to say, I expatiated on the value of the imports from Africa and the West Indies and North America to Great Britain.
And that should Mr. Wilberforce's plan for the prohibition of a further importation of Negroes into our islands take place, the consequences would be total ruin and impending destruction.
John's brother Banasta abandoned reasoned argument for abuse of abolitionists. He called them
the junta of sectarians, sophists, enthusiasts and fanatics, out to destroy a trade worth £800,000 a year and employing 5,000 seamen.
I don't actually think that there is much point in looking back and saying my family were dreadful or anything like that. I think that they were doing what everybody was doing at the time, and it was not considered to be an awful thing.
Wilberforce introduced a bill to end the slave trade almost every year from 1788. Each time he failed.
96 was quite a landmark, where he really hoped to have his bill going. But then they were defeated by the very popular opera, which was on at the time, on the third reading. And all his supporters were away at the opera, and they didn't turn up in time, and he lost it at the third reading. Absolute terrible thing. So this was always likely to happen when Wolfes didn't exist, and anyhow he was only a private member. So there were always these adverse votes and disappointments.
The noble cause seemed likely to founder, but astonishingly the first crack in the wall of resistance came from the planters themselves. In the Caribbean, the relentless work and cruelty meant that for every 100 slaves, only one child was born each year. The labour force was maintained by continuously importing slaves from Africa. But by 1800, planters had grasped that allowing slaves to marry and live in easier conditions would produce new slaves at no extra cost. Some offered incentives. In Barbados, 6 shillings and 3d per child. As the planters' resistance weakened, the abolitionists were winning new converts in Britain's ports. Thomas Clarkson found that the slave voyages were as dangerous for the crew as for the slaves. He used the fact ruthlessly.
One of the arguments for the slave trade was that it trained sailors ready for the British Navy. Well, Clarkson added it up, and of all the sailors that were on the slave trade that were gathered each year, about half of them failed to return home. And this was a key fact to Wilberforce, which he was able to put before Parliament.
The political establishment remained reluctant to abandon slavery. They valued Africans not just as plantation labour, but as soldiers. Black men had bolstered the West Indian regiments for decades. At the height of the abolition debate, the King's generals were still desperately buying slaves.
It is universally admitted that the black force in the West Indies should be augmented as much as possible with a view to lessen the consumption of the European troops. The best mode of effecting this augmentation would be to take every advantage of the time allowed before the Act takes effect, and enter into a contract with the merchants at Liverpool to furnish 2,000 to 4,000 slaves of the tribes from the Gold Coast at Barbados, from whence they could be distributed as the officer commanding should direct. Half, or certainly 1/3 of this number, might be taken at the age of 16, well-made and healthy lads.
By the early 1800s, Britain was fighting a great war against the French in Europe and the Caribbean. The politicians, searching for a way to unite the nation, put on the mantle of moral superiority. Napoleon permitted slavery in French colonies, so Britain would abandon it.
This is a way of, if you like, rebranding Britain in an advantageous way. The British establishment can stand up in 1807 when they abolish Britain's participation in the slave trade and say it distinguishes us against the French whom we are fighting. They have reintroduced slavery. We, the British, are pulling out of the slave trade. So if you wanted to be cynical, you could say that this is a cause which has an appeal not just to reformers, but to the establishment, to orthodox patriots who can see it as one more proof of Britain as the supreme land of liberty.
In 1807, a weary Wilberforce finally gained his victory. The establishment U-turn gave the abolitionists the votes they needed to outlaw the slave trade.
Great speeches were made by the politicians, and then they all paid tributes to him, and he sat, so he said, with his head between his hands, tears pouring from his eyes. It was the greatest moment in his life.
Today, the abolition of the slave trade is regarded as a parliamentary triumph for Wilberforce, now commemorated in Westminster Abbey. But abolition was the work of many hands. It needed the contributions of Granville Sharp, Olaudah Equiano, and a host of others guided by the tactical genius of Thomas Clarkson.
Slavery had its Oscar Schindlers. Heroic in a quiet sense, they were just moved by just a sense of dignity and an outrage that in their own country, which values liberty and freedom, and freedom of the body from indiscriminate abuse, that this should be happening to black people. Whether they were black or not, it didn't matter, but they happened to be black. So a simple moral outrage and a courage to take on the establishment and to win.
The Christian reformers' victory had only halted the trade. For the hundreds of thousands still enslaved in the Caribbean, freedom would only come after violent rebellion.